You're listening to TBR Radio Presents, the Dixie Heritage Hour, with your host, the Director of Dixie Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
I want to start today's broadcast by saying that if you have not yet gotten your copy of the special September-October 25th anniversary issue of the Barnes Review magazine, you just need to stop whatever it is you're doing and you need to go to the www.barnesreview.org website and you need to order a copy. This is probably the greatest issue of the Barnes Review that has ever been published. I say that. Actually, I'm very fond of the Defending Dixie issue of a couple of years ago. But at the very least, this one runs a very close second. It is the largest issue of TBR magazine that has ever been published because it's the 25th anniversary issue. And everything was put into this. And it's just a great issue. And you need to go and get a copy of it if you don't already have one. But our guest today is Dr. Matthew Raphael Johnson. And I know some of you are saying, well, Dr. Johnson was just on the show, and he was. And we have Dr. Johnson on frequently for a couple of reasons. One is because I love Dr. Johnson. He's one of my friends, and I love chatting with him. I love talking with him. And he's a great guest. And another reason is because every time Dr. Johnson's on the show, we have a huge rating spike. So y'all obviously love Dr. Johnson too. And so Dr. Johnson is our guest today. But the reason I invited him on so soon, so close on the heels of his last appearance, is because not only was the 25th anniversary issue of the magazine one of the best that's ever been put out, one of the best articles in that magazine, and that issue was written by Dr. Johnson, and it was Dr. Johnson's article about Hitler's views on Christianity. And rather than commenting on what other people said that Hitler said about Christianity, he quotes Adolf Hitler directly, primarily quoting Hitler from a number of his speeches. And Dr. Johnson even quotes Hitler more in this interview, I believe, than he did in the article, if for no other reason because he had the material close at hand and did not have the space constraints of an article and so forth. And so Dr. Johnson's going to be our guest today, and we're going to talk about what did Adolf Hitler really believe?
Yeah, part of the reason I wrote it is so many people make the argument that he was a pagan. And although I think that's the case with Himmler and maybe a few others, it's certainly not the case with Hitler.
My personal opinion of Hitler is that Hitler was just extremely well read, especially in, things like religion and philosophy. And a lot of his reading, was contradictory. But,
yeah.
I get the impression that Hitler was able to draw what he thought was the best stuff or the usable stuff or the stuff that he could make use of, from any of a wide variety of sources, whether that be Nietzsche or Jesus. And, they were totally in contradiction of each other.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very similar.
But I don't know that he was a strict adherent to either, or a critic, or a hater, or an opponent of either. It was like he was well read, and he took what he thought he could use from wherever he could get it, and had a unique way to unite people of varying opinions under his banner.
No, he was a politician first and foremost. Well, Willis Carto always said, and you have to understand him as a politician. But he says so much. See, the anti, as you see here, the anti-Christian stuff comes from the table talks. But I'm not convinced at all it's true. I come out with all kinds of contradictions in it. Stuff that he would contradict elsewhere. So, I just went through so many speeches of his. I mean, hundreds of them, and took what, any kind of religious concept from it, and then it differs so radically from the table talk. I don't think the table talk is real.
Right.
And there's things that he wouldn't say. If you remember that, I don't know how controversial that section has become because a lot of people accept the table talks. But I'm pretty confident. It's just it's not only does it say things differently, but the opposite. And he says things in such a way that he doesn't say any other place. And the Barnes Review sells the table talks.
Yeah, they do, and I know Pat Shannon quotes from them very heavily in his article, which follows yours, which was Hitler's views on the United States.
Yeah, and Paul and I talked about. Paul accepts my point of view only because this section here is, I think I'm pretty convincing. It's so opposite of what he says everywhere else, but still, he's a politician. But given his popularity after a while, and the things that he's done, he rebuilt the Russian cathedral in Berlin with his own money after I'd been damaged. So I'm pretty sure I know what he is. But again, he's a politician. He's going to do things that make him popular, and he was concerned with that, and he was a popular man. And also that Hitler wasn't a fascist, I think is pretty clear too, because of his rejection of Mussolini's doctrine on the state. You don't have a lot of people on our side who are academically able. You don't have a lot of people who can systematically go through texts and criticize them. And so this all seems to be up to me.
Well, let's go ahead and start. And maybe the first question should be, for someone whose primary area of expertise and interest is Russia, why the article on Hitler in Germany?
Well, I don't think that's a very good question. I write about everything from 50 Shades of Grey to movie reviews to Asia. Half my stuff is on Asian material. Specializing in something doesn't mean that that's all you do.
Right. I understand that. I'm just wondering what drew you to be interested in this particular investigation.
Right. Right. Well, I talk about Russia quite a bit in here, but yeah, I write about everything. I've been doing that for years and years. The specialization that doesn't mean that you're forbidden to talk about other things. I talk about everything under the sun that has any kind of political or philosophical concept to it. So
what drew you to study Hitler's views on Christianity? What made that of interest to you?
I'm sick and tired of hearing, the National Socialist pagans are really irritating. They're an irritating group of people. They hate Christ more than any Jew has ever done. They say the most vicious things, and they're completely illiterate. And I'm only half kidding there. They honestly believe that the Jews created Christianity and protect it. They will tell you that. That's how stupid they are, because they've never read anything Hitler's ever said. They don't know anything. I wanted to quote all the times where he not only supports Christianity but condemns the old so-called pagan ideas, which no one knows anything about. So that's what got me started. It was I was provoked into it.
Well, what I have noticed is, I've not read Hitler as extensively as you have, but I have read Mein Kampf.
Uh-huh.
Is how often Hitler talks about Mein Kampf, or rather how often Hitler talks about God or about the church or about Christianity, and even sometimes specifically quotes the Bible within Mein Kampf.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and that's how he was raised. And because the Soviets were atheists, he's definitely going to react in the opposite direction. Yeah. I don't know if he went to church, or if he went to a Lutheran church. I don't really know.
Well, I know he grew up Roman Catholic.
That I know. That's true.
Yes.
But in power, I've never heard of him going to church on Sundays.
Well,
or that he ever had.
This is my personal opinion. And Paul and I talked briefly about your article in last week's radio broadcast. What I told Paul was my personal opinion is that Hitler was in an interesting situation politically in Germany, in that about half of the country was Roman Catholic and half of the country was Lutheran.
Right.
And had he gone to either church, he would have probably been perceived to have been not only the ally of that group, but the enemy of the other.
That's right. He'd have to be both.
Yeah. And so it was easier for him to quote the Bible outside of the church, thus positioning himself to be, in a position to be heard by both groups. But had he actually darkened the door of either, he would have excluded himself from the other.
Yeah, clearly. That makes, I think, pretty much any politician, with the exception of those in the Catholic Center Party, And even there, I mean, they had to, in the southern part of the country, you don't have to worry about Lutherans, but any national level politician has to be like that. Yeah.
And another thing that struck me as interesting was here over the summer, I read generally on Degrelle's book, Hitler Democrat, and I had written a review for that in the last issue of the magazine. And early on in Degrelle's writing, he talks about Hitler and religion, and he said that some of the most profound conversations on religion and the Bible that he had ever had, he had had with Adolf Hitler. And that Hitler, contrary to popular belief, as you've stated, he said Hitler was very much a Christian, that he wasn't a pagan, that he wasn't an agnostic or an atheist.
Right.
But that he was very much a Christian, even though he didn't go to church, even though he didn't necessarily talk about, religion using the platitudes that a lot of Christians would use.
Right.
That when you got to know him and have intimate personal conversations with him, say in his home or in his office and so forth, that that quite often he would just start talking about a certain portion of scripture or a certain incident in the Bible, and he would start making applications from it, and that his thinking religiously was actually very profound, even though if you didn't get to know him, you would have never known that.
That's right. And because we can't trust anything we hear about them today, in the West, about Hitler. Someone like Degrelle is invaluable. I read that when we first had that translated years ago. Degrelle changed my opinion completely on Hitler and the Third Reich. I mean, think of it like this. The system needs us to hate Hitler. The Jews need us to hate Hitler. Well, so he needs to be a racist for the left to hate him. Well, how are they going to get the right to hate him? Well, he has to be anti-Christian. He has to be a materialist. He has to be a socialist. So they push both sides so that both groups will hate him. They've been doing that for a long time. They need a way to get right-wingers to despise him too, because the last thing that they want is, him to make a comeback among right-wingers.
You said most of your source material were from Hitler's speeches.
All of them, yeah. I think almost all of them.
And so why did you choose your source material from speeches rather than books? It would seem, at least, that the books would be more readily available than the speeches, and maybe I'm wrong about that.
Oh, no, the speeches are everywhere. The speeches are what he, connected himself to in public. I quote Mein Kampf a couple of times here. But the speeches, again, and then you could see the development of his thought from the 1920s all the way to the very end. And if anything changed and what his stresses were and everything else. And there's so much more of it. There's so many more speeches, and there are, there's really only one major book. And that was really a prison diary more than anything else. I mean, he couldn't cite sources or anything in it because he was in jail. So, but as he grew older, as he got more politically experienced, those speeches are his public face on every conceivable topic. That's where, the overwhelming majority of his ideological stuff can be found.
So if somebody wanted to find an English copy, an English translation of Hitler's speeches, where would they go to find that?
Oh, I was using a few websites because even mainstream websites have them all. Because it's so much easier for me to cut and paste or to copy and paste them. And then you could search for terms and everything else. I didn't want to use hard copy for that. And actually searching for terms, a million speeches, searching for terms like church or Christ or God or something like that made my life a lot easier. derfuhrer.org has most of his speeches published in English. I'm looking at it now. You can put, Adolf Hitler's complete speeches, whatever. You're going to get stuff all over the place. But Der Fuhrer has some great translations that I used. And I would say, I'm looking at his speeches page right now. God, they've got hundreds and hundreds, and they're organized into year. So from 1921 to the very end, and that's valuable for me because I want to see if he changed at all. If as he grows older and gets more mature, how things differ. He's not going to say anything that he doesn't believe, and he's talking to the world in most of these speeches. So this is really who he is.
If you love listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, then I know that you'll love reading the Barnes Review. The Barnes Review is one of my favorite magazines. I began reading the Barnes Review long before they became a sponsor here on the program. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II, and the late Cold War, there's just not a more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So if you'll visit www.barnesreview.org, that's www.barnesreview.org, you can find out how you too can become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review by mail, or you can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review electronically in PDF editions. Or you can subscribe to receive both. That's what I do. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. The source material for these speeches. Were they transcripts where somebody had sat there and transcribed his speech as he was giving it, or was the source material where he had written his speeches out himself before he had gave them? I mean, because they didn't really record things back then like they do now. So obviously,
most of the time it was and there's this Hitler.org speeches. Everything is here. The mountains of stuff. This stuff was written out. And that's really where it comes from, because these were published in newspapers and stuff like that. So you can get his speeches anywhere. I mean, there's a million sources for it in English. And for the most part, they were written out. I think most politicians did that back then. These were written texts that were published elsewhere and then, done in newspapers and magazines and everything else. I don't know if they do that. I don't think they really do that today. I think it's mostly transcribed today. But they certainly did record things back then. I'm not sure in the early 20s. But no, these were all written out, and then these were published all over the place afterwards.
And so you were reading Hitler's speeches from 1921 to 1944, 1945.
Yep.
And
yeah,
in all of that period of time, you've got not quite a quarter of a century there. You were saying you wanted to see if Hitler changed. Had Hitler changed, and if so, was his change or was it evolution? Or
no, I'm seeing very little change. I see very, very consistent ideology. I think that's what people expected of him or any statesman. Maybe there's a certain greater level of sophistication in how he put things or how he wrote things. I'm sure, chances are these were probably dictated to somebody beforehand. But really, ideologically, no. I'm seeing very, very little. In fact, that struck me from the beginning that there was no real ideological change here. He's the same man, because obviously if something works and gets him elected and gets him popular years ago, he's going to stick with it.
As you're analyzing these speeches, and I know it's kind of hard to just read something on a piece of paper and to know the heart of a man, but do you see Hitler as somebody who had a genuine faith, or do you see Hitler as someone who just had a religious upbringing and not hostile to Christianity and therefore, quoted the Bible every once in a while because it stirred up the masses? Or
Well, that's a really good question. My father considered himself an atheist, but he respected the church very much as a cultural institution. He recognized the good that it did and had a genuine affection for it. I'm not saying that's what Hitler was, but he recognized in the anti-communist movement, the first thing that the Soviets did is destroy religion. Therefore, there must be something to it. There's a lot here that really has this very, very passionate enthusiasm to it that I refuse to believe this is just talking.
Right.
Because there isn't a whole lot that you can go to elsewhere that he says the opposite of it. And some of these are really, tremendously devoted emotional concepts. Now, I know Degrelle agrees with you, but he was a very private man in this respect. He wasn't going to impose religion on anybody because of the divisions in the country. Of course, the one thing he wouldn't tolerate is materialist atheism because of who it was connected to, and rightfully so. So he was. So I think whatever he did, it was very private. He wanted to be seen as a military leader, but a military leader with religious edge to him. And I don't know. I wish I knew, and I can't find much about his practices, except as Degrelle says, he was very, very private about it. So no, I think he did believe it. But like all of us, he struggles with it. And he has to be so careful with the denominational stuff that it's hard to tell. He couldn't be publicly. Now he gave speeches in Catholic churches and in Lutheran churches. I have a few that I comment here, so he goes to both. And now the enthusiasm is such that again, he is a politician. Understand him as a politician, and he does have to talk like that. But I think he believed it. Yeah.
From what I gathered, based on a few things that he said in Mein Kampf and a few things that Degrelle had said, was that Hitler saw some things in the church when he was growing up, that being in the Catholic Church, that he didn't always agree with, and a lot of that didn't necessarily have to do with the church itself, but with individuals within the church, bishops or priests or individuals who he thought were not quite living up to the ideal that they preached, maybe. To some degree, the theology that Hitler developed and some of the conversation that Hitler had with Degrelle, that Degrelle talks about a little bit, it wasn't that Hitler was creating his own religion, but to some degree he was kind of going in his own direction, because in his own personal theology, if you will, he was not wanting to make the same mistakes that he saw as a kid when he was going to Sunday school and to Mass and so forth.
Well, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, we're all imperfect. No one can live up to these very, very strict ideals consistently. The truth or falsehood of a religion or a movement has nothing to do with the behavior of those who hold it.
Right.
Because there's good and bad. There's good and bad everywhere. And I don't know enough about his time as a young man, as an altar boy in Austria. He was at a Benedictine monastery. He served there for a while. I simply don't know enough to answer that.
Okay.
But again, as a politician, he's got to be really careful. The Catholic Center Party, Monsignor Haas, as Degrelle says, it fell apart just because Catholics were flocking to Hitler.
Right.
They were terrified of the Soviets as anybody else, and the only man who was going to stand up to them was him. But he was so careful to be non-denominational, which makes perfect sense, and because how deeply divided it is. And remember, the Soviets took over the most Catholic area and made the Bavarian People's Republic for a short period of time. So these Catholics, for a very brief period of time, know what the Soviets were and know what communist rule is. So he was highly sympathetic to them, and I don't think I know that I didn't have this in the article, but he did admire the Roman papacy. He admired the organization. He admired the political aspects of it, and even to some extent sought to imitate it. That's something Willis Carnell used to talk about all the time. Was his view of the Roman papacy was extremely positive, although on secular grounds. That if you're going to organize something, that's how you organize something.
You're probably more knowledgeable about this than I am, but at the time during World War II, if my memory serves, Pius was the Pope.
Pius XII through most of it, yeah.
Yes, and if my memory also serves, he was a bishop in Germany before the war. And so it's very possible that, while World War II was going on, that there was a pope in place who had probably no doubt encountered the younger, politically rising Hitler and some of the very speeches that you were reading and commenting on in your article.
Exactly. Pius was the papal nuncio to Germany. He knew the German government inside out. He knew it extremely well. I know that the attacks on Pius have been ridiculous and overwhelming as the years have gone on. But if there's anyone who knew Germany from the Catholic point of view, it was Pius. He was careful to not make directly political statements in terms of German politics, but he knew the politics there extremely well. So he was more than just a bishop there. He was the nuncio.
Okay. But I know that Pius has also taken some flack here in recent history because of the fact that he was fond of, and I believe had even given some papal awards to Adolf Hitler during the Second World War. Whatever Hitler was doing in Germany, obviously the Pope was pleased.
Yeah, and I can't imagine how he couldn't be, especially given the threat of the Soviet Union. That, after World War I, you have a broken Western world. You have the Western world trading and building the USSR, as we talked about before. The The infrastructure of of industry came from the West. Who's going to fight this guy? Who's going to fight Stalin? So yeah, he had every reason to back Hitler, to back and the Russian Orthodox Church is the exact same way. I could quote him right here. No, it is not we who have deserted Christianity. It is those that came before us who deserted it. National Socialism neither opposes the church nor is anti-religious. On the contrary, it stands on the ground of real Christianity. Our interests can't fail to coincide because our fight is identical. And that was in 1934. And what he says about the pagan, and this is always something I enjoy quoting from those illiterate pagans, is that on page 204 in Mein Kampf, he condemns it. He says that people keep harping on that far-off and forgotten nomenclature which belongs to the ancient German tribes and does not awaken any distinct association in our age. The habit of borrowing words from the dead past seems to mislead people into thinking that the external trappings of its vocabulary are an important feature of a movement. It is a mischievous habit, but one quite prevalent nowadays. So he made fun of this idea. There's so little that's known about it. So in Mein Kampf, he actually mocks the concept of this pagan revival nonsense, which I have no doubt irritated Himmler and to some extent Rosenberg, who was attempting to rebuild something like this. Now, Hitler was very, very clear with his point of view. But as far as the papacy is concerned, what reason could he possibly have to dislike Hitler? He, and especially in the 30s, he was building up his forces against the Soviets. He was creating legitimate social justice. And there's no denying that you could be the most anti-Hitler person in the world. You can't deny what he did economically and how quickly he did. And plus, Hitler says over and over again what Christ said about the Jews in the New Testament, what he said about the Pharisees, the leadership that they were loyal to. He rips them to pieces. So he clearly sees a common ground there, and that's very important to him.
So Paul Angel commented to me last week. He said that Hitler very much saw Jesus' struggle and his own struggle as synonymous.
He says it right on Mein Kampf, page 11. He says he drove those enemies of the human race out of the temple of God because then they used religion as a means of advancing their commercial interests. He says it over and over again that we have the exact same struggle, and for that reason, at least for that reason, he identified himself with the same struggle. So yeah, he did see that. He says that over and over again, and he recognized. But that was the mainstream opinion at the time. Today, of course, it's not. But back then, everyone knew. So there was no doubt he saw the struggle as exactly the same.
I know this did in your article that you spent a lot of time commenting on some of Hitler's comments about Jews, but being anti-Jewish or having a struggle with Jews or having a problem with certain aspects of Jewish behavior or Jewish religion or Jewish whatever does not necessarily make one a Christian.
No, but it doesn't hurt.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, it doesn't hurt. It's if anything, that was the beginning. I think that because one of Hitler's favorite passages was when Christ drove the money changers out of the temple, mm-hmm. and in kicking the bankers out early on, he sees himself as doing the exact same thing. But who couldn't see that? Who couldn't make that connection? One of the reasons that the Catholic Center Party fell to pieces, as Degrelle says, is that they weren't necessary anymore. Hitler was their champion. What did they need a separate party for? His opposition party, except the communists, just dissolved because he was doing everything they promised to do in their campaigns. I have another article on Hitler and the Russian Orthodox Church where I get into some other things of a very similar foundation. There's so much stuff here. He says in 1922, he says, "My feelings as a Christian points me to my Lord and Savior as a fighter. It points me to the man who once in loneliness, surrounded by a few followers, recognized the Jews for what they were and summoned men to fight against them, and who, God's truth, he was not. His greatest not as a sufferer, but as a fighter. And boundless love as a Christian and as a man, I read through the passage which tells us how the Lord at last rose with all his might to seize the scourge, to drive out of the temple the brood of vipers and adders." So this is some of the reason I'm absolutely convinced that this was real for him, and that for the Jewish issue, at least as a foundation, this is what brought him to come in and accept the faith one way or another.
Well, you had even said in one of there in the article, in one of the speeches you had quoted, Hitler was talking about the corruption of government, and you know how men are inherently sinful, and that's no different whether they're in government or out of government. And then he basically said that if it weren't so, Jesus would never have had to have died on a cross.
Yeah, I mean, this is some of the things that Degrelle is talking about, that he had an ability to connect Christ's words, as well as, the Old Testament law, to what he was doing. I mean, he really thought he was building an island of social justice in a sea of injustice. And to a great extent, that was true, which is one of the reasons he had to be destroyed.
Extra, read all about it.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are because you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. Visit www.americanfreepress.net.
Extra, read all about it.
There are some that would say that Hitler's ultimate goal was that he wanted to first get the churches and the Christian people kind of in his camp. Then the next step would have been, they would have licensed the churches in Germany. And then, of course, the step after that would have been they would start to impose theology and doctrine into the churches of Germany. Then they would start, the priests and the pastors of the churches of Germany would basically become agencies of the state. And then the end game would be you would have one unified Nazi German state church. But I just don't see that as either A, something that would have been practical, or B, something that, just based on what I have read of Hitler, that he would have wanted to do.
I think there were people in his party who may have wanted to do that. But Hitler would have no reason to do it. They supported him tremendously. He would have no reason. I mean, he spoke of his own humility in front of the church, that he couldn't possibly match what the church has done in German history. He's absolutely, humbled, and he says, and he is such a powerful speaker. Well, he says this. He says in 1933, he's talking about a politician who said that Christianity was threatened by him. And he says, this man says that Christianity, Bowles is his name, says that Christianity and the Catholic faith are threatened by him. And I could answer, in the first place, it is Christians and not international atheists who now stand at the head of Germany. I do not merely talk Christianity. I profess that I will never ally myself with the parties which destroy Christianity. If many of you wish to threaten Christianity under your protection, I would ask, where was Christianity for them in those 14 years when they went arm in arm with atheism? No, never, at no time was greater internal damage done to Christianity than in these 14 years. He's talking about the Weimar Republic, of course, when a party theoretically Christian sat with those who denied God in one in the same government. So he's talking about the Weimar Republic, where, various liberal hack politicians would sit in the same parliament as communists and join forces with them on certain issues. And he says, don't talk to me about defending the church when you were allied, at least on certain issues, with the communists, when you refused to fight when the Jewish communists took over Bavaria. Don't talk to me about defending Christianity now when I'm the only one who has made it state policy. So he had harsh words for people who would say that. But in this day and age, as you know, you could pretty much say anything about Hitler. If it's negative, it will be believed and will be published. You could come up with the craziest conspiratorial ideas, but there has to be evidence for that, and there's not a shred of evidence for it in Hitler's policy. Now, I do say, and I've said this for a long time, that if Hitler won the war, I think Germany would be split right down the middle, because I think that in creating the SS and putting Himmler and Heydrich and others, the Gestapo ahead of it, he created a division between Christians and sort of these neo-Nietzschean types. He created his own deep state, and I think there would have been a war between Himmler and Hitler if he had won, between the regular army and the SS, just like the regular army had a problem with the SA. So I think this would have been a problem later on, but Hitler would have been the defender of the churches, and Himmler would have been, as the head of the SS, would have been someone who really didn't want anything to do with him. Himmler was a bad guy, in my opinion. He is no one to be admired. He was hired because he was a great organizer. But there was so much what Himmler said that Hitler did not take seriously. And Himmler must have winced when he when he read or heard some of these speeches.
Well, do you think that the reason that Himmler was kind of allowed to come up through the ranks and rise with Hitler is because Hitler had a very strong sense of loyalty to people, especially those who had been with him since the beginning? You know, one of those things where somewhere along the way, Hitler realized that he and Himmler might not have been on the same page on a lot of things, but, you know, this guy was there in the beginning and you know, back in the early days when sometimes they literally had to fist fight their way to a podium to give a public speech. You know, Himmler was right there beside him, you know, in the fight. And it's, you know, there's a loyalty issue there. And it's kind of hard to dump somebody who had stood with you through the tough times.
That's a very good point. Himmler supported Hitler and all of his pro-Christian stuff without being a Christian himself. He clapped at all the speeches, promoted him all the time. Because he was there for so long, because he organized the SS with such brilliance, he would have been crazy to get rid of him. And yes, he was blind. Degrelle says this. Like Nicholas II in Russia, Hitler was surrounded by traitors. He was surrounded by people who took advantage of the fact that he, you know, was not an experienced politician when he started running for office. Took advantage of some naivete and sought to use him to promote their own agenda. I've talked about that in Ukraine, the SS destroying the war effort in Ukraine over and over again. Yes, you're absolutely right. I think misplaced loyalty. Near the end, I mean, 1945, he was excommunicated from the party. Not too long before he killed himself, he said, this man has been an enemy of mine for a while, and he's now thrown out of the party. There was a group of others he did too. And the Posen speech, I've been saying this for a long time too, the Posen speech in 1943 in Poland was a disaster. He's talking about colonizing Russia. He's talking about making slave labor out of the Slavs as the front is collapsing. As he's losing the war, this is what he's talking about. The Posen speech is available in English. It's a nasty thing. There's no conceivable way that Hitler would support something like this. And yet this is what Himmler is talking in a closed session of the SS, eventually became public. But to say that as the war is almost over, as he's already lost the war by this point, saying the Slavs are not our allies, we're going to destroy them. We're going to turn them into slaves. Digging trenches is the exact phrase he used. This is some of the stuff that eventually leaked back to Hitler and created a tremendous disconnect between the two men.
One of the pictures that was in your article there showed a church, and the church was being used as a campaigning center to get people to vote for the National Socialist slate. They didn't actually, I guess, in that early election, they didn't vote for individual candidates like we do. You know, basically you voted for slates. It was almost like you had to go into the place and pull the lever for straight ticket. And so the church showed these Christian people standing out in front of a church, and the church itself was advocating for people to pull the lever, if you will, vote the straight ticket National Socialist for Hitler and his slate of deputies. Do you think that maybe the politicians in this country paid attention to contemporary history? For example, when Lyndon Johnson pushed the whole 501c3 thing through Congress, you know, you were only a decade or so removed from Nazi Germany in World War II at that time. Do you think they saw what a powerful force these churches were, and they wanted to make sure that the churches couldn't become that kind of a force in this country?
That makes a lot of sense. I didn't pick that picture, but it was a good one. I believe it was a Lutheran church that his party members were registering voters. Yeah, it was a proportional system. So you would vote for a party rather than a person. I think that has a lot to do with it. I think he saw that the churches, if, you know, when they're brought into contact with someone like Adolf Hitler, particularly in a crisis situation that Germany was in the 30s, 20s and 30s, that they will mobilize their people. The Catholics did it to some extent in 1960 for Kennedy. I think my father was the only Irish Catholic on the planet that didn't vote for JFK. But that's a minor matter. I know the black churches have been very important in organizing the black vote, especially down south. I personally never took a tax exemption or anything else because there's a certain control. You can't do anything political when you have one of those. You have to be very, very careful. You could lose it. So as a form of control, it's significant, yes. And I think that's one way of keeping them under watch.
So you had mentioned that Hitler had rebuilt the Russian Orthodox cathedral somewhere in Germany there. You had mentioned that.
Yes, he did. I've had to remind my Orthodox friends that the Orthodox Church outside of the Soviet Union was absolutely fanatically in favor of everything Hitler did. And it got started because with his own money, he rebuilt the cathedral, and then he received a series of letters from Metropolitan Anastasi. And it wasn't just because Hitler was a foe of Stalin. It was also that what he was building in Germany is what they wanted to see in Russia. Anastasi says, and this was, again, the exile group thrown out of the Soviet Union in the 20s, said, this is what we want. We need a Russian version of you. This is how you rebuild a broken country, and our Russia's broken too. And he called him, the harbinger of social justice, that the rebuilding of the cathedral for him was a symbol. It was a symbol for the rebuilding of the church as a whole. The fact that he used his own money for that he took them so seriously and respected them as supporters against the war against Stalin, of the war against Stalin, that he was willing to spare no expense. And Russian Orthodox politicians or bishops all over Europe were falling over each other, trying to get into Hitler's good graces. It was only in the USSR where they were told to condemn Hitler, which they did. But otherwise, especially in Ukraine, they couldn't have been in supporting him anymore. The Orthodox Church was and the bishop in Germany was Seraphim Lade, who was a German convert from the Baltics, whose portfolio he was the Metropolitan of the Reich, no matter how big it was. Wherever the borders were, that was his jurisdiction. And of course, all the churches were in communion with him fully. He was never condemned for this. He died a natural death in 1951, I think. And so the Russians were extremely thankful to Hitler for what he did. And he received letter after letter from bishops from Ukraine and Russia, in exile, of course, thanking him for the invasion of the USSR and seeing him as a modern crusader. And so they really, they loved him. There's no doubt about it.
So how big do you think the Russian Orthodox Church was in Germany at that time?
Well, I think a lot of them in the East, in parts of East Prussia, you certainly had thousands of Russians, but then you had the exile groups that were settling in Germany. So, six figures. I think in Berlin it was a fairly substantial community.
I mean, so it was big enough, and the questions. I'm not asking this question to besmirch Hitler's motives. So don't think that. It's just that what I'm trying to get at is, do you think that they were a big enough voting bloc potentially that this could have been politically motivated, or were they a small enough group that this was simply Hitler being a benefactor because he could? Or maybe it was a combination of those as well. But
I'm not even sure if votes were the issue. It was just that he saw this group of people as victims of Bolshevism. So he was automatically sympathetic. This was a seal of his promise to destroy communism wherever it was found. So, of course, these guys who are legitimate victims of the Soviet Union are going to be flocking to him. And I think that had more to do with it than anything else. I wish he used them more. Now, as the war went on, he didn't use them very much. And the SS were kind of throwing them out of any position of authority. But this is a man, was welcomed to a great extent. Here, this is the great hetman of the Cossack hosts, Krasnov, who was a National Socialist himself. And he does speak for the church when he says this. He says, when the bodies of executed Czechists swim along the rivers and the heads of the communists are slaughtered, only then will people know the end of this abomination has come. I ask all Cossacks to be told that this war is not against Russia, but against communists, Jews, and their henchmen who sell Russian blood. May the Lord help the German weapons and Hitler. Let them do what the Russians and Emperor Alexander did for Prussia in 1813. We need our Russian Orthodox Hitler. Moscow is squeezed in the spasms of Bolshevism, and it must be conquered with the iron hand of a German soldier. And that was echoed not just by the Cossacks, but by Metropolitan Anastasi and by the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia, and even those in communion with Constantinople. This was a common idea, and the letters that he received when he invaded Russia were overwhelming. And I just wish that he would, they offer themselves as translators, they offer themselves as scouts. They offered themselves as fighters. Unfortunately, the SS put the kibosh on that, and it was really stupid on their part. And the SS did so much damage in Ukraine. As you know, I've spoken about that quite a bit with Eric Koch and what the SS did in destroying the Orthodox Church there, almost as if he's working for Stalin. He saw them as a threat somehow. I think that this was legitimate. I think he saw them as victims. And I think that votes, I don't think, were the issue. He was so popular, he didn't really need votes. That wasn't the issue. I think he's saying, I'm on your side and I need you.
The North Carolina Heritage Political Action Committee was organized by concerned citizens of North Carolina in 2015 in response to the increased attacks on North Carolina's history and heritage. The North Carolina Heritage PAC supports state and local candidates for public office who pledge and show their support for the protection of Confederate memorials and the preservation of all of North Carolina's history. We all know that Confederate memorials and symbols are the easy targets, and that the end game of our leftist enemies is to erase and rewrite all of history, from the colonies to the War on Terror. If we fight them for our state's rich Confederate history and heritage, we may be able to stop them from their mission of total destruction. Join the North Carolina Heritage PAC now by visiting ncheritagepac.org. Once again, that is www.ncheritagepac.org. And help us on the front lines of North Carolina politics. The mission statement of North Carolina Heritage PAC is that the North Carolina Heritage PAC was created with the purpose of supporting diverse efforts to defend and preserve the heritage, traditions, monuments, cemeteries, flags, emblems, and other legacies of North Carolina history against those efforts to remove, deface, legislate against, alter, and otherwise corrupt or pervert their meaning, history, presentation, and standing in our state. Once again, www.ncheritagepac.org. So you had said you had written an entire article or an entire academic paper on Hitler and his relationship with the Russian Orthodox Church.
Yeah.
Just, I guess, kind of give us the synopsis of that paper, or just kind of share the highlights with us, maybe.
The Orthodox Church is a nationalist institution. It's organized ethnically. They saw Hitler as similar to the Tsar, especially Alexander III. They were so scarred at what Stalin had done to the church, what Lenin and Stalin had done to the church, that when Hitler finally rose and rebuilt Germany, they couldn't believe it. They saw him as a divine messenger. They saw him almost in Old Testament terms. And Seraphim Laid was always a full, far more supportive of Hitler than probably any other religious group in Germany at the time. The fact that he was given authority over all the Orthodox in the Reich is something that no other bishop got in Germany. He got this tremendous amount of authority there. And at least early on, Hitler saw them as very useful. These are people who know what it's like to live under Bolshevism. Listen to these people. And he saw them as, this was extremely important to him. Really what I talked about was the letters that they wrote him, especially Metropolitan Anastasi, who was the head of the exile group, and about his constant thanks and praise of Hitler, not just for what he was doing militarily, but how he was reorganizing, that there was such a great degree of social justice and workers' rights and everything else. He said, this is what Christian politics and economics really is. And when the war was over, of course, these guys had to run and hide from that. But it's what they said at the time.
One of the first places, of course, that Hitler had invaded was Poland. And Poland had a very large Orthodox community within it. So how did the Polish Orthodox respond to Hitler and Hitler to them?
Well, I have a paper on this. The Polish Orthodox were about 90% Ukrainian. And of all the groups in Europe, non-German groups that supported Hitler, Ukrainians were by far the most enthusiastic. The fact that Metropolitan Seraphim was given this huge portfolio, I mean, he didn't really have a diocese. It just was as big as his right gets. That's your jurisdiction, which is kind of odd. So he clashed with Metropolitan Dionysian, who I've read about substantially. I have several broadcasts many years ago on him. And the problem with Dionysia is that, remember, the Polish government was anti-German. It was a nationalist government, but wanted nothing to do with Germany, especially in areas that they had just absorbed. This was a brand new country after World War I. And northern and western territories of Poland were German. And so Dionysia was in a terrible position. On the one hand, he wanted to support the Polish government that he was connected to, although he didn't like him very much. On the other hand, he wanted to support the anti-communist fighter par excellence, and that was Hitler. And he eventually came to an agreement with Seraphim. It was uneasy, but you simply couldn't find, I mean, if you're going to find someone who didn't like Hitler very much, you're going to find it in Poland. But because the Orthodox Church was not Polish, it was overwhelmingly Ukrainian. But then again, Seraphim Laid was a part of the Russian Church, so there's a certain rivalry there. It wasn't an easy truce for the sake of the war effort. And remember, during the Russian Civil War, the Poles were one of the strongest fighters against the Reds. They drove the Reds out of Ukraine when Ukraine was ruled by the Directorate. They had their own reputation of being an anti-Bolshevist force too. So there was a lot of canonical issues there, a lot of complexity there. The Ukrainians loved Hitler tremendously, until, of course, the SS was brought in, and that was a separate story. And remember, so many of the Ukrainian sections were under the Soviets before 1941. Because in 1939, Hitler invaded part of Poland. The Soviets invaded the other part, which never gets discussed. The West had no problem with the Soviets invading Poland the very same day Hitler did. They were prepared to go to war to defend Poland, but had no problem with the Soviets doing the exact same thing. And the Soviets invaded and took parts of Poland that were, mostly Ukrainian, and that became a problem. And so many of their communities were dissolved. But when Hitler invaded, needless to say, and drove them out, they were extremely excited. And church activity went through the roof. I mean, far greater even than you would think. It was this tremendous enthusiasm that greeted German troops, because these people had their own institutions, their own Orthodox institutions that had been very quickly destroyed by the Soviet invasion. And these people would be the first ones to tell you. I knew some of them. I went to church with them in Lincoln, Nebraska, immigrants there from the Orthodox Church in that part of Poland. They brought me into Orthodoxy, in fact, at St. George. They're the first ones to tell you that everyone knew that Stalin was planning on invading Central Europe, which is why they had so many millions of men on the border with no barracks. And so they saw this coming. Unfortunately, Hitler destroyed himself by putting the SS in charge of the administration of these places. And then he had millions of volunteers from the Slavic areas that were willing to fight for him that he never used. And I think that even as the war is ending, and I think the SS had a lot to do with that. So again, there's this huge division between Hitler on the one side and the SS on the other.
And I know this isn't really the topic of our conversation today, but in reading Degrelle, and he talks about Hitler in the early days and how the political establishment of Hitler's day would literally employ goon squads to keep Hitler or anybody else who wanted to shake the political apple cart, to keep any potential competition silenced. They would have these goon squads. So Hitler and his group would want to run a beer hall and give a speech or have a rally. The goons would show up and bust it up. And so the SS started kind of as Hitler's private little security force. In other words, Hitler's group was the one group that would fight back, and the goons would show up, and his SS guys would fight the goons, and then the goons realized that, that we're going to leave this group alone because they're not just going to let us come up and bust up their beer hall. They're going to fight back, and that's too much work for us. And so Hitler kind of owed his political existence and success to the SS. Is it possible that because of that, and even though it might have been a misplaced trust, I mean, you can kind of see why he would have had such a trust there, and he would have put the SS in place of the regular army, thinking, well, this is my private army that's been with me for the last 15, 20 years. I can trust these guys.
Well, you're thinking of the SA,
Okay.
Ernest Röhm's, the stormtroopers that were eventually dissolved.
Okay. Thank
yeah,
you for the history lesson then.
Well, yeah, that was his security force. And you're right, though. There were riots every day in Weimar Germany. No one trusted in political institutions. The police had no role. They were overwhelmed all the time. There was no army to speak of. So, what was going to happen? I mean, this is how politics were in the Weimar Republic. So he organized the SA for that very reason. Now, Ernest Röhm was purged. May or may not have been a homosexual, but the SA grew to be several million men. And the regular army got very upset with this. These were mostly blue-collar guys, street guys, tough guys that end up beating the crap out of the communists, because the communists were the only ones really who had these goon squads that were vicious. And so many of the SA guys were former communists because they realized that Hitler was doing what the communists promised. And they were false promises anyway, because they didn't really believe what they were saying. The SA was meant to be an elite ideological force that served at the ideological and philosophical core of the Reich. They did have their security organizations, and later on it became Hitler's security force. There's no doubt about that. And they were the elite fighters of the German Reich. But early on, it was the brown shirts. But because of who those guys were, that they were street guys and former communists and everything else, the very aristocratic officers in the German army said, you're going to get rid of them. And that's exactly what he did. How many of them were brought into the army? How many? I don't know the details there. But Hitler knew that he needed what you're saying isn't entirely wrong, in the sense that he needed someone who was able to organize a force like that. That he broke his teeth politically at a time where rioting and violence was the way to get from point A to point B. There's no doubt about that. That's what the Weimar Republic was. It had no legitimacy whatsoever. Violence was all there was. No other party did this. No other group did this. If Hitler didn't create the SA, the communists would have taken over entirely, because they were the only ones who were willing to fight like this, and were getting money from abroad. They did take over part of Germany for a while. So despite the fact that the SA was dissolved pretty early on, that didn't mean that Hitler abandoned the idea of having a personal security force. And the SS did perform to some extent that role. So you're not wrong in that regard. And I think, again, I quote Willis Carto here, and I think he's right about it. Hitler has loyalty to Himmler because he was good at what he did. He was a first-rate organizer. He created this elite force very quickly and without much money. And it became a feared organization and became the heart of the German Reich. The problem was, in religion, they had nothing to say to each other. But you had this loyalty, this respect for what he did, which clouded his judgment. I also think that in places like Ukraine, where the SS was destroying Orthodox churches, and as the Soviets had done, because they didn't like Christianity, they didn't like the Slavs, etc., I think Hitler was being lied to. I think he was getting a lot of false intelligence, saying that stuff's not going on, that's Soviet propaganda, that's American propaganda, that's not true, and so didn't intervene. I'm absolutely certain that if Hitler knew what Koch was doing, he would have intervened very quickly. But he couldn't get involved in the minutiae of administration when he had the broader war to fight. Right. So I think he's simply being lied to.
So you had mentioned that Orthodox Christianity is very much nationalist in its thinking, in its scope. And of course, Hitler was very much a nationalist. Do you think that it was Hitler's study of the Bible and his understanding of Christianity that inspired his nationalism?
Well, he says so. Because back then, people took the Old Testament seriously. The Old Testament is a extremely political book. In fact, it's almost an entirely political book. And the people of Israel is talked about in the most ethnically nationalist terms you could imagine. It was a consistent and thoroughgoing, systematic nationalist ideology there. And this is, of course, was the church, became Israel as time went on. So there's no denying it. The Old Testament is in the Bible and just as important as anything else. And back then, people took it more seriously than they do now. And he did see the ethnic aspects of old Israel, and he quoted it all the time. And so there's no doubt that from the Old Testament especially, Hitler understood that this was the Christian point of view. The whole point of the Old Testament is that it lays out a Christian politics.
And I'm going to go ahead and cut it off right here because we are out of time for this week's TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. But I want to encourage you once again to get your hands on a copy of the 25th anniversary issue, September-October 2019 issue of the Barnes Review magazine. It was just a great issue, and you need to go to barnesreview.org and order a copy right now. I'd also like to encourage you to go to my website, www.dixieheritage.net. When you do, you can sign up for my newsletter. You'll get it every week, free and clear, no cost, no obligation. And when you sign up for the free newsletter, I'll even throw in a copy of my book, The Truth About the Confederate Battle Flag. Once again, absolutely free, no cost or obligation. So from all of us here at TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour, God bless. See you next week.